In flat Wyoming grassland, an 82-foot vertical drop sits hidden, invisible until you are standing right on its edge. For tens of thousands of years, animals never saw it coming. It is called Natural Trap Cave, and the name is exactly what it sounds like. At the bottom, bones have been dated back potentially 100,000 years, sealed in cold, wet darkness that behaves almost like a refrigerator. And that darkness held on to something scientists never expected to find intact: DNA still recoverable from bones tens of thousands of years old, revealing that some of Wyoming's Ice Age predators were not the species everyone assumed. Scientists still rappel into this hole today on a single rope to keep reading what it recorded. At the base of the Bighorn Mountains in northern Wyoming, near the Bighorn Reservoir, there is a stretch of ridge that looks like nothing at all. Flat, open grassland, the kind of unremarkable terrain you could walk across 100 times without ever suspecting what it was hiding beneath your feet. No warning signs written into the landscape itself, no obvious dip or depression visible from a distance. Just ordinary ground, right up until it suddenly is not. To understand what is actually sitting under that ridge, you first have to understand the geology working quietly beneath the surface for thousands of years before anyone ever fell into it. This is karst country, land built on limestone, a type of rock that dissolves slowly when water works its way through it. Rainwater seeps down through cracks in the stone, and over an extraordinarily long stretch of time, that water eats away at the limestone from the inside, hollowing out empty space beneath the surface, chamber by chamber. Eventually, the thin shell of rock still holding up the roof of that hollow space simply cannot support its own weight any longer, and it gives way. In most cases, that collapse creates what everyone recognizes as a sinkhole, a shallow, sloped depression in the ground. But this particular collapse did something different. Instead of forming a gentle slope, it left behind a set of vertical walls, dropping straight down into the earth with almost nothing to break the fall. That drop measures roughly 82 feet from the surface to the floor below, opening through a hole only about 15 feet across. And here is the detail that makes this specific formation so much more dangerous than an ordinary sinkhole. Just before you reach that 15-foot opening, the ground drops away slightly first, a small, subtle ledge that hides the true edge of the hole until you are almost standing directly on top of it. By the time anything walking across that ridge actually sees the hole, it is already too late to stop. That single design flaw in the landscape is exactly why this place carries the name it does. Natural Trap Cave. Not a cave anyone dug, not a cave anyone built. A cave the land itself assembled purely by accident into one of the most effective traps any landscape has ever produced on its own. Think about what that actually meant for tens of thousands of years running. Animal after animal, generation after generation, crossing this same stretch of ridge with absolutely no way of knowing what waited just ahead of their next few steps. A startled deer running from a predator, a bison following a familiar seasonal path across open ground, a curious young animal wandering slightly off from the herd. None of them would have seen anything unusual about the terrain until the exact moment the ground disappeared beneath them entirely, and by then, there was nothing left to do but fall. 82 feet down onto solid rock, into total darkness. Over and over, for tens of thousands of years, this ridge quietly claimed whatever wandered across it at the wrong moment, with no warning given and no chance offered to correct course. And this was not some ancient danger that faded away once modern life arrived on the scene. The hole never stopped being a hazard, not even in the 20th century. In 1971, someone very nearly drove their Volkswagen Beetle directly into it, discovering the hard way just how invisible that ledge really is until you are already committed to crossing it. That near miss is the exact reason a heavy steel grate now sits fixed permanently across the opening, specifically installed to stop people and vehicles from becoming the latest additions to whatever the cave had already been quietly collecting for tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to cover it. But the grate only solved the danger sitting at the surface. It did nothing to change what had already been accumulating, layer after layer, in the darkness, 82 feet below, for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Because every single animal that ever fell through that opening, going all the way back before recorded history even began, had nowhere left to go once it hit that floor. And that means the true story of Natural Trap Cave was never really happening at ground level at all. It was happening in complete darkness, far below the surface, in a floor that had been quietly recording every single fall for tens of thousands of years before a single human being ever thought to climb down and actually look. The first people to actually climb down into that darkness were not scientists. They were cavers, drawn by nothing more than curiosity about what an 82-foot hole in the Wyoming ground might actually contain. One of them later described the process plainly, rigging a rope off the axle of a vehicle parked on the surface, dropping the line down into the opening, then rappelling straight down into the dark and climbing back out the same way once the visit was over. This was not an official excavation. There was no research plan, no scientific team standing by, no sense yet that this particular hole in the ground was anything more than a curious local landmark. What that first caver found at the bottom, back in 1967, was a mound of material sitting directly beneath the opening, soft and crumbly under the boots, clearly made up of bone and organic debris that had been accumulating for some time. But at that point, nobody had any real reason to think it was anything remarkable. The bones scattered through that mound looked recent: rabbits, deer, the kind of small modern animals that might wander across open ridge country and stumble into a hole exactly like this one, generation after generation, right up to the present day. Interesting, certainly, but not yet understood as anything more than a local curiosity, a strange pit that occasionally claimed unlucky wildlife. That began to change in 1970 when an archaeologist named Lawrence Lohendorf took a closer look at the site and recognized that it might hold real scientific value, well beyond a simple accumulation of modern bone. Lohendorf conducted an exploratory excavation, carefully documenting what the cave contained, and just as importantly, taking deliberate steps to protect and preserve the specimens already sitting inside it for whatever research might follow. That single decision, made early and made carefully, is a large part of why so much of what came later was still intact and scientifically usable decades afterward. By the middle of the 1970s, that early groundwork had grown into something considerably larger. A full team of paleontologists, led by Larry Martin from the University of Kansas and Miles Gilbert from the University of Missouri, arrived to conduct the first major formal excavation of Natural Trap Cave. And what they found waiting for them at the bottom of that dark shaft went far beyond anything the earlier casual visits had suggested. Buried in the layered floor of the cave was one of the most complete fossil records anywhere in North America, spanning the transition out of the Pleistocene epoch and into the Holocene, the exact geological boundary marking the end of the last ice age. Think about what that transition actually represents for a moment, because it sits at the center of one of the biggest unresolved questions in North American science. The Pleistocene was the ice age itself, a period stretching back roughly 1.2 million years and lasting until around 11,500 years ago, marked by repeated waves of extreme cold across the continent. During that stretch of time, North America was home to an entire cast of massive animals that simply do not exist anymore: saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, camels, mammoths, and mastodons, all of them roaming a landscape that looked nothing like the Wyoming of today. And then, right around that same narrow window marking the shift into the Holocene, nearly all of them vanished. Not gradually spread out across many thousands of years, but clustered tightly around that single geological boundary, as if something specific had happened right at that transition point. That clustering is exactly why scientists studying Natural Trap Cave keep returning to this particular boundary layer with such intense focus. A fossil record this complete, spanning precisely the window when an entire generation of Ice Age giants disappeared from the continent, has the potential to answer questions that scattered, incomplete sites elsewhere simply cannot. But answering those questions properly would require far more than a single excavation season back in the 1970s. It would take decades of additional work, entirely new genetic technology that did not even exist yet at the time, and as it turned out, a return to the cave that would not happen again for another 30 years. That boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene marks one of the strangest disappearing acts in the entire fossil record of North America, and after decades of study, scientists still genuinely disagree about exactly what caused it. This is not a settled question with one obvious answer sitting quietly in a textbook somewhere. It is an active, ongoing argument, and Natural Trap Cave sits right at the center of it. Start with exactly what vanished, because the scale of the loss is almost hard to fully picture. Saber-toothed cats, animals built around teeth longer than a human hand, simply gone. Dire wolves, larger and more powerful than any wolf alive today, gone. Short-faced bears, towering predators that dwarfed modern grizzlies, gone. Camels that once roamed the open plains of North America, gone. Mammoths and mastodons, the true giants of the Ice Age landscape, gone as well. And the truly strange part is not simply that these animals went extinct. It is that nearly all of them disappeared at almost exactly the same moment, clustered tightly around that single narrow boundary separating the Pleistocene from the Holocene, rather than fading out gradually across many thousands of scattered years. When an extinction event lines up that precisely with a single geological moment, it demands an explanation, and researchers studying this period have landed on two competing ideas, both genuinely plausible and neither one fully settled even now. The first explanation points directly at human beings. As people first arrived and spread across North America, the theory goes, they hunted these massive animals for food on a scale significant enough to drive entire species toward extinction, species that may have had no evolved defense against a new, highly coordinated predator suddenly appearing on the landscape. The second explanation points instead at the climate itself. The same narrow window marks the moment the glaciers were retreating rapidly, reshaping habitats, water availability, and vegetation across the entire continent in a remarkably short span of time. And large mammal species, history shows again and again, tend to be especially vulnerable to exactly that kind of rapid environmental upheaval, far more so than smaller, more adaptable animals. Here is where it is worth being honest about what the Natural Trap Cave research is actually built to answer, and what it is not. The team working this site is not primarily trying to settle the human arrival question directly. That is simply not the angle their evidence is best suited to address. Instead, their approach is narrower, and in some genuine ways, considerably more precise. They are tracking how the animals themselves physically changed as the climate around them shifted, differences showing up both in their genetic material and in the actual shape and structure of their bones. And they are cross-referencing every one of those biological changes directly against fossil pollen recovered from the very same sediment layers, painstakingly rebuilding what the actual plant life and habitat of Ice Age Wyoming looked like at each specific point in time. Think about what that approach actually offers, that a simpler survey of bones alone cannot. Instead of just cataloging which species existed and when they disappeared, researchers are attempting something considerably more ambitious, an entire working recreation of the end Pleistocene environment in northern Wyoming, built piece by piece from genetics, bone structure, and preserved pollen all layered together into a single coherent picture. It is not just asking what animals were here, it is asking what the world around them actually looked like, breathed like, and felt like in the specific months and years each one of these animals was still alive. But building a picture with that level of precision demands something most fossil sites in the world simply cannot provide: bones and pollen preserved well enough and undisturbed enough to still carry that kind of fine-grained detail after tens of thousands of years underground. Natural Trap Cave, it turns out, is one of the vanishingly small number of places on the entire continent where that level of preservation genuinely exists. Getting to that evidence, however, would prove to be its own considerable undertaking entirely, a challenge that had almost nothing to do with the science itself, and almost everything to do with simply finding a way back down into the dark. There is exactly one way into Natural Trap Cave and exactly one way back out, and neither of them involves anything close to a staircase. Anyone working this site has to rappel the full 82 feet down on a single rope, and once the work session ends, climb every single foot of that same distance back out under their own strength, using hand ascenders to slowly work their way up the line one grip at a time. There is no ladder bolted into the rock. There is no elevator, no scaffolding left permanently in place, no shortcut of any kind. One researcher working the site described her daily routine with a kind of dry understatement, calling it a particularly strenuous commute to get to her own field site each morning. Think about what that actually means for the pace of real scientific work. Every single tool, every sample bag, every piece of equipment needed underground has to be carried down that same rope by hand. Every researcher and every volunteer has to be physically capable of ascending 82 feet of open rope at the end of a long day of careful excavation work, often while exhausted, often while carrying gear. There is no version of this fieldwork that does not begin and end with genuine physical risk every single time anyone goes down. Given that reality, the team responsible for running this site could not simply rely on university researchers alone. The vertical skill required to safely move people up and down that rope day after day across an entire field season is a specialized discipline in its own right, closer to technical caving than to traditional paleontology. So the project turned directly to Wyoming's local caving community, putting out a call to regional caving societies and grottos for volunteers with the exact rope skills the site demanded. The response was significant. Experienced cavers showed up in genuine numbers, and by every account from the researchers who have worked alongside them, they quickly became some of the most valuable, most dedicated people involved in the entire project. One volunteer in particular has taken on the role of the team's head of safety, returning to the site for weeks at a time every single summer, specifically to keep everyone moving up and down that rope securely. Researchers on the project are direct about it. Work at this scale, at this depth, simply would not be possible without him and without the broader Wyoming caving community standing behind this effort year after year. But bringing in skilled volunteers only solves part of the challenge, because not everyone arriving to help already has that level of vertical experience. Training people well enough to move safely on rope, in the limited amount of time available before each field season begins, comes with real limits that have to be honestly acknowledged. As one team leader put it plainly, there is simply no way to turn every new volunteer into a highly proficient vertical caver in a short window of preparation. The actual achievable goal is narrower and more practical than that. Get each person trained to a level where, if something genuinely goes wrong 80 feet underground, a rescue can still be carried out safely and effectively. That is the real bar the entire safety program is built around. Not mastery, but a dependable, well-rehearsed margin of safety for everyone involved. Picture what that training process actually demands of a volunteer standing at the edge of that hole for the very first time, learning to trust a single rope with your entire weight, suspended 82 feet above solid rock, in low light, often while carrying tools or sample bags strapped to your body. Learning to ascend that same rope entirely under your own physical effort once the day's work below is finished, arms and legs already tired from hours of careful excavation. This is not incidental to the science happening at Natural Trap Cave. It is the price of admission for every single person who wants to help uncover what is actually preserved down there, a barrier to entry written directly into the landscape itself, the same way it always has been. And once someone finally does make it down to the cave floor, rope work behind them for the moment, they step into conditions completely unlike almost anywhere else they have ever worked. Because the very thing that makes this descent so exhausting and so demanding is also, unexpectedly, exactly what has kept everything below so extraordinarily well preserved for tens of thousands of years. Here is the number that makes all of the difficult rope work worth it. Researchers have successfully pulled genetic material out of bones recovered from Natural Trap Cave, dating back close to 20,000 years, intact enough to actually sequence and study. In the world of paleontology, that is an extraordinary result. DNA is fragile. It breaks down steadily over time, degraded by heat, by moisture cycling in and out, by ordinary exposure to open air and shifting temperature. Most fossil sites on Earth lose that genetic information long before they ever reach anywhere close to 20,000 years old. Natural Trap Cave did not. The reason comes down almost entirely to the same conditions that make the descent so grueling in the first place. This cave sits at a remarkably stable temperature, almost never climbing above roughly 42 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the height of a Wyoming summer on the surface far above. Combine that constant cold with humidity running somewhere between 80 and 90%, and you get an environment researchers themselves compare directly to a refrigerator, cold, damp, and stable, sealed away from the wide temperature swings and drying winds that destroy genetic material almost everywhere else on the surface of the planet. Think about what that comparison actually means in practical terms. A refrigerator does not just slow down spoilage, it slows down decay itself, at the molecular level, keeping organic material intact and usable for far longer than it would ever survive sitting out in the open. Natural Trap Cave has been running that exact same process, entirely by natural accident, for tens of thousands of years straight, without a single power outage, without a single door ever left open. Steady cold, steady moisture, no direct sunlight reaching the floor, no dramatic freeze and thaw cycles disturbing the sediment. Just the same stable, damp chill, repeating itself day after day, century after century, for as long as that ridge has been quietly swallowing animals into the dark below. The result places Natural Trap Cave in genuinely rare company. Researchers studying the site have pointed out directly that the only other locations on Earth offering this same quality of ancient genetic preservation sit in Siberia and the high Arctic, places where permafrost does naturally what this single Wyoming cave manages to do, purely through its own underground geometry and climate, without a single inch of frozen ground anywhere nearby. A hole in the middle of open Wyoming grassland, sitting in the same tier of preservation as the deep Arctic permafrost. That is not a small claim, and it is exactly the kind of detail that turns a fossil site from simply interesting into something genuinely world-class. And the DNA extracted from that cold, damp darkness has not just sat quietly in a lab confirming what scientists already expected to find. It has actively begun rewriting some of it. Because when researchers finally applied modern genetic testing to bones that had spent decades sitting in collections, confidently labeled by species based on how they looked to the naked eye, some of those identifications turned out to be wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in ways that changed the entire understood range of an animal across the North American continent. That discovery did not come from a single obvious specimen sitting out in plain sight, ready to be recognized on site. It came from careful, patient laboratory work, extracting genetic material from bones that had already been resting in storage for years, then comparing those sequences against known species with a level of precision that simple visual inspection could never achieve. And what that comparison revealed would go on to quietly rewrite a piece of North American natural history that had been accepted without serious question for decades. Somewhere in the middle of what researchers had spent years confidently filing away as one particular Ice Age predator, the actual genetic code told an entirely different story. One that stretched an animal's known range across the continent far further than anyone had previously documented, and revealed a level of hidden complexity in these ancient populations that bones alone, without the DNA locked carefully inside them, could never have shown anyone at all. For decades, the wolf bones pulled out of Natural Trap Cave carried a confident, unquestioned label: dire wolf. It was a reasonable assumption on its face. The cave was old enough, the location fit, and dire wolves were a known, well-documented predator across Ice Age North America. Nobody had a strong reason to doubt the identification, and for years that label simply sat attached to specimen after specimen in storage, treated as settled fact rather than something still worth testing further. Then researchers actually ran the genetics, and the confident label fell apart. The wolves recovered from Natural Trap Cave were not dire wolves at all. They were ancestors of the Beringian wolf, a distinct subspecies of gray wolf that, up until that point, had only been documented much farther north, in Alaska and the Yukon. That single genetic result quietly rewrote the accepted range of an entire subspecies, extending its known territory far deeper into the continental United States than anyone studying North American wolves had previously believed it ever reached. Think about what that actually means for how confidently scientists had been reading these bones before the DNA got involved. An animal sitting in a drawer for years, correctly aged, correctly located, and still completely misidentified by species, simply because a wolf bone from one lineage can look remarkably similar to a wolf bone from another without a genetic test to tell them apart. The shape alone was not enough. It took the DNA itself, patiently extracted from bone that had been sitting cold and undisturbed for thousands of years, to finally correct a mistake nobody even realized had been made. And that was not the only case of mistaken identity to come out of this cave. One specimen, initially logged in the field as what researchers believed was a Beringian wolf ankle bone, was sent off for further testing along with the rest of that season's finds. Months later, the results came back, and the bone did not belong to a wolf at all. It belonged to an American cheetah instead. It is a small, almost humbling detail, and it says something honest about the actual difficulty of this work. Even trained, experienced scientists, working carefully and methodically, get individual bones wrong out in the field on a regular basis. Identification in paleontology is genuinely difficult, and the fossil record does not make it easy on anyone, no matter how many years of expertise they bring to the excavation. But the wolf correction turned out to be only the beginning of a much larger pattern emerging from the genetic work at this site, one considerably bigger than a single misidentified species. As researchers pulled and sequenced more and more ancient DNA from bones recovered across multiple field seasons, a consistent signal kept turning up across several different animals, not just the wolves. Many of the species preserved inside Natural Trap Cave carry clear genetic evidence of hybridisation between North American and Eurasian populations, meaning their ancestors were not simply native to this one continent in isolation. Their family lines had crossed the Bering Land Bridge, likely more than once, moving back and forth between two continents as the climate itself shifted the terrain beneath their feet. Picture what that migration pattern actually looked like on the ground, playing out across thousands of years. As colder periods expanded the glaciers and closed off the ice-free corridor connecting the two landmasses, populations that had once been one single continuous group found themselves suddenly stranded on opposite sides of an ocean, separated by ice rather than open water, cut off from each other for however many generations it took for the corridor to reopen again. And when it finally did reopen, at least some of those separated populations found their way back together once more, interbreeding, mixing their genetic lines back into something new before conditions shifted again and pulled them apart a second time. That is not a simple story about one species quietly living out its existence in one fixed place for tens of thousands of years. It is a story about entire populations being pulled apart and pushed back together repeatedly, driven by a climate that kept changing the map underneath them again and again, all of it written directly into the DNA still locked inside bones, sitting on the cold, damp floor of a single Wyoming cave. Natural Trap Cave is not only a record of what died, it is an unusually honest one, a nearly unbiased snapshot of exactly what lived on that Wyoming landscape across tens of thousands of years, with no predator or scavenger's choices distorting the picture. Scientists are already using it for more than the past, studying ancient droughts lasting centuries that reshaped entire ecosystems, information now feeding directly into how modern Wyoming plans for water and land use today. The grate over that hole stops cars and careless hikers now, but it has not stopped the science. Most of the cave floor is still unexcavated, still sealed and cold and dark, waiting on the other end of a single rope.